Hello everyone, this is part 5 of What If Naruto Was Abused and Leaves Konoha, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
As he took in the sight before him, Naruto's inner skeptic couldn't help but comment. For a hidden village, Sunagakure really stuck out from the surrounding flatlands, easily spotted from miles away. In fact, it was an awe-inspiring sight, comparable with Konoha's famous North Gate. The mighty stone walls rose up like cliff faces on either side of a narrow passageway, barely wide enough for 3 men to walk down side by side. Kyuubi told him that it was the only entrance in or out of the village, or at least the only obvious way, as there were bound to have hidden routes in ninja villages. There were also protective seals on the surfaces of the impressive walls designed to stop any chakra-based maneuvers that might help enemy ninja scale the walls. Not only that, but the defenses themselves were staggered upwards with a daunting array of Suna ninja constantly alert and ready for any hint of invasion or infiltration. The entire sight from up close was enough to make both children gulp with anxiety. They walked up, both desperately fighting their body's natural urge to tremble when faced with such an overwhelming show of military prowess. Naruto quickly realized that the village hidden in the sand easily lived up to both of its monikers. There was certainly a lot of sand, the discomfort in his shoes told him as much. The desert surrounding them acted as almost the initial layer of defense for the village, keeping out all but the most determined would-be visitors or attackers. Few would bother trying to find the village if they didn't already know where to look, and the size of the desert combined with the locations of the oases made it impossible for any enemy to reach it conveniently. It was only because of Naruto's heightened smell and Kyuubi's directions that they were even able to make it here without a map. Without one or the other, they could have spent weeks wandering the desert or simply have died from dehydration long ago. The thought brought another gulp to Naruto's throat as he began approaching what appeared to be the ninja guarding the entrance. He was an average-sized person with the white veil that seemed practically mandatory for many Suna residents. One could immediately tell that this was a job that the man had been in for years and had lost interest in not long after he received the position. He was stuck in a twilight state of Chunin that never quite reached Junin and ended up with the same eternal menial task. Of course, for 2 7-year-olds that fact was lost, and the imposing man lost none of his intimidation factor. If anything, the bored manner with which he carried out the job only added to it. He narrowed his eyes when he saw 2 solitary children approach him, seemingly from out of the desert itself. He peered harder and tried to find the adults that must be with them, but when that failed, he just stared at them, wondering if the desert heat had finally gotten to him. When he realized he wasn't in fact seeing things, he looked over the children more carefully. Once he did, he realized that they each carried packs as if they had been on a long hike. For them to actually be here, that must have been true. He was about to address them and ask what their business was, still in disbelief about just what he was seeing, when a higher-ranked sensor nin dropped down from the defense layer above him. He quickly sprinted towards the gate guard as Naruto and Tayuya watched on with both anticipation and slight concern. The new arrival would occasionally throw fleeting glances their way when he whispered to the first guard. Once he was finished, he took one more look at the pair, or more specifically Naruto, and then vanished in a blur, sand lightly floating down from where he had been standing. The original guard coughed loudly and was once again joined by another sand shinobi, this time being the one whispering into the other's ear. Naruto was starting to become highly anxious, and even though she didn't say anything, he knew Tayuya was feeling the same way from the way she reached over and took his hand lightly. He knew she mustn't have even realized she was doing it. She wasn't exactly the hand-holding type. The first ninja finished and returned to lazily leaning against the passage wall, keeping an eye on the horizon. The newest guard quickly walked over, slightly scaring the pair as he made a beeline directly towards them. The new arrival was similar to the first guard in that he was of average height and size, but instead of the more traditional veil, his whole head was wrapped up in linen bandages, so only his nose and eyes were showing. "I have been instructed to bring you straight to the Kazekage. Please follow me." He said nothing more as he quickly turned on a heel and started walking down the tight passageway. Stunned for a few moments, Naruto just stared after the man, as did Tayuya. Sensing this, the ninja turned and gave the 2 a look that said he wasn't going to wait for very long. That was sufficient in snapping the pair out of the shock-induced paralysis, and they very quickly hurried after the man, barely keeping up with his long strides. Past the intimidating outer wall, the children could breathe a sigh of relief, before taking another sharp intake of air as they looked around the village proper. It was a beautiful sight to behold. The buildings themselves seemed to rise out of the very land itself, taking abstract and often intricate forms. Whilst everything seemed to be made out of the same beige stone that didn't stop each building from managing its own individuality. Banners and brightly colored ornaments hung from windows and walls. Each opening in the walls, be they balcony or window, emitted the warm glow of a lived-in home. Even the shops could be easily distinguished, with the various wares and means of advertising proudly displayed, ready to catch the eye or nose of any passerby. In a way it was exactly the same as Konoha, the same spirit and energy. In others it was completely different, the alien architecture and fashions of the people, to name a few. They made sure to stick close to the guiding ninja. His long and fast strides meant they almost had to jog to keep in line with him. Suddenly he stopped, almost making Naruto bump into him from behind, but he managed to catch himself. The reason soon became clear when another sand ninja appeared in a swirl of dust and the two talked animatedly. Naruto tried to be patient, but that was hardly in his personality. Soon he began to fidget, and not long after that he started to look around. They seemed to have moved into a less densely populated area of the village. Large formations of rock rose up erratically, and the entire area seemed to be some kind of playground. A group of children were running, playing a game with a ball that Naruto recognized but never learned the name of. He smiled. Now that he was here, maybe he could join in with them, maybe he could have the fun that they appeared to be having if the joyous cries were anything to go on. As the ninja escorting them continued to talk to the latest newcomer, Naruto watched the game transfixed, trying to learn how it worked. He was just beginning to understand that it had something to do with getting the ball to one of the two ends of the field before one of the kids kicked the ball slightly too hard. It shot away from the group, bouncing away to one side. It rolled, coming to a stop at the feet of a small child standing next to a set of swings. Naruto looked at him for a moment as the boy hesitantly picked up the escaped ball. He was small, smaller than Naruto, but they were obviously around the same age. His spiky red hair sat in a mop on his head, not dissimilar to Naruto's own hair. He wore a beige wrap around his upper body and shoulders and a pair of darker shorts with plain sandals. In his other hand he clutched a stuffed toy which Naruto noticed looked particularly worn from age. The child approached the larger group, almost as tentatively as he had picked up the ball itself. After a moment of what seemed like self-deliberation, he held the ball out to the other kids with a meek smile. The reaction he got wasn't at all what Naruto was expecting. The children seemed terrified of the boy, pointing and nervously whispering amongst themselves. When he took another step forward, it was the final straw. The children took off, screaming and crying in fear of him. Even more unexpected was what happened after that. The smaller boy extended his hand, almost longingly, tears openly streaming down his face. As if in reaction to the boy's torment, the very sand at his feet wreathed and moved before shooting out, ensnaring the foot of the child that had originally kicked the ball towards him. Naruto was moving before he fully understood what was happening himself, his body just working on instinct. He arrived just in time to block the powerful stream of sand that was aimed directly at the ponytailed boy on the floor. Naruto's arms were crossed over his chest protectively, bleeding from the mass of sand that had hit him. The boy behind him took the chance to scramble to his feet and sprint away, not even glancing behind him at the boy who had saved him from injury. The red-haired boy for his part looked on at Naruto with dread. He was still crying and he took that moment to turn and run. He accidentally dropped the bear he had been holding so that he could bring his arms up to attempt to wipe the tears from his eyes. Naruto wasn't sure what to think. The boy had seemingly controlled the sand through his will alone, yet at the same time his face easily showed he was just as frightened when it happened as the boy he had inadvertently attacked. Naruto looked down at the discarded bear and towards the fleeting form of the boy, and that was all it took to make up his mind. He grabbed the bear as he ran, determined to catch up to him and get some answers. It was difficult. The kid knew Suna better than Naruto did and he almost lost him a few times, but luckily he eventually found him. He was hunched over at the end of the darkest part of an alleyway, the only indication that he was there at all were the quiet sobs coming from the shadows. Naruto approached cautiously. He easily discerned the small boy's form from the surrounding darkness with his eyes and walked straight up to him. The boy took a moment out of his crying to look up at Naruto. It seemed he had as little difficulty seeing Naruto as Naruto did him. Naruto held out his hand, in it the boy's discarded bear. When he did nothing, Naruto moved closer, still with the bear held out between them. The red-haired boy just looked at him with wide, tear-stained eyes, disbelieving almost. He even rubbed them once as if he believed Naruto would simply vanish as a hallucination. Why don't you run like the others? Naruto smiled as kindly as he could as the boy finally accepted the bear, clutching it close to his chest like it was his own mother. Naruto walked a little bit closer and sat down opposite him. Your eyes. The boy looked startled, but no less hesitant or disbelieving. A finger moved up to his eye and lightly traced around the thick black lines that encircled it. My eyes. Naruto nodded slowly, his smile taking on a more somber and saddened look, one that he had no difficulty in dredging up as he looked back over his life. Our eyes are the same. The boy seemed to peer into Naruto's eyes for what seemed like an eternity, searching for what it was the blonde meant. Why you have it too? He turned away, looking at the ground. The loneliness and the pain. Naruto nodded again, still slowly, he didn't want to startle the boy. Why do they run from you? First the other boy looked up in shock, like he just expected Naruto to know, and even if he didn't, he still saw the display earlier. TDS sand. Naruto firmly shook his head, cutting him off before he could finish. You tried to help them, giving them back the ball. Why did they run? The other boy seemed almost desperate now. He was having a conversation with somebody his own age. He felt like if he told him the truth he would lose this one shred of normality. Sensing his discomfort, Naruto tried something else. This boy had intrigued him. There was something about him like an intrinsic bond between the two, like they could relate on some unseen level. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. The other boy looked up, visibly relieved at the change in conversation. Gaara no Subaku. Naruto smiled brightly. The warmth he emitted encouraged Gaara to try his own, weaker smile. Before the conversation could develop any further, they were interrupted by a swirl of dust that deposited the ninja guide from earlier and a frightened Tayuya. I told you to follow me, and mid-sentence the guard saw the other occupant of the alley and took an instinctual step back. Gaara, I did not know you were here. He thought for a moment. I was given orders to bring you to your father if I saw you. Gaara nodded meekly, but the smile that Naruto had given him just managed to stay where it was. The older ninja walked over, and when the three children were all around him, he made a hand sign and the four of them disappeared in a swirl of dust. Naruto had never experienced a shunshin before, and it was disorienting to say the least. Immediately he lost his sense of balance and would have fallen over if it weren't for the firm hand on his shoulder. It seemed the older ninja wasn't taking any chances on losing his charge again. After a moment of confusion and his senses catching up to his location, Naruto realized he was in an area that was unfamiliar to him. They were in an office of sorts built out of the same stone as the rest of the village, but lavishly furnished. Despite the lush walls and floor, the desk that was the center of the room was rather plain, just a normal rectangular wooden desk. Even so, it managed to convey the importance of the man sitting behind it. He was a thin but well-built man with shaggy auburn hair not dissimilar from Gaara's. He wore a black collared shirt with a mesh shirt underneath. He maintained a perfect look of indifference as his eyes lazily, but attentively, moved over the four entrees. Gaara, wait outside. I will speak with you later. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable authority behind the words that spoke of his importance. Gaara nodded meekly and timidly walked out of the room with his head hung low, red hair falling across his eyes as he did so. The ninja who had escorted Naruto and Tayuya this far took that as an opportunity to walk up to the man. By now Naruto had recognized that this was the Kazekage, evidenced by the white robes and green trimmed hat that hung on the wall. Once he made his realization, he bowed his head down low. Earlier he had run away from his guide, and right now he didn't want to cause any more of a disturbance. This was his fresh start and he wouldn't let anything ruin it, not even himself. Tayuya just looked across at him, furrowing her brow at the odd behavior. She didn't have the benefit of having known a Kage personally and didn't fully understand the position she was in. The side of the Kazekage's mouth twitched up into a small smile, amused by the small child bowing to him. That is not necessary, Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto raised his head slowly, the worry evident in his eyes. How did you know my name? The Kazekage merely smiled again in the exact same way. I am the Yondaime Kazekage. There is nothing in this village that I cannot find out. Seeing Naruto's slightly awed expression, he chuckled rather humorlessly. If you must know, the ninja that escorted you heard you say your name when you introduced yourself to my son. Naruto let out a slightly sheepish smile while rubbing the back of his head, the unspoken tension in the room finally broken. The Kazekage leaned forward in his chair with his elbows resting on the sturdy desk and his hands forming a pyramid as he peered closer at the young boy. I am not one for small talk nor long drawn-out conversations. I had you brought here because one of my sensor nin detected the presence of a strange chakra signature. His glance flicked between the two children. That would either make you enemy ninjas that are hanged or under some kind of genjutsu. His stare hardened and seemed to rest on the both of them simultaneously, causing both children to gulp audibly, or one of you is a Jinchuriki. He's talking about you, Kit. A Jinchuriki is one who bears a biju sealed within them. Naruto nodded in understanding, drawing a curious glance from the Kazekage who took the nod as a sign that he was correct. Interesting. If I may ask, which of the tailed beasts do you contain? Naruto looked at the man nervously even as a growl rolled through his mind. I hate that name, it's almost as bad as demon. Naruto just laughed timidly, unsure of what to do. You may as well tell him, Kit, he is the leader of this place and will not hesitate to kill you if he deems it necessary. The nine-tailed fox, Kyubi. The Kazekage's eyes widened for a moment and his features gained a broad grin as he took in the news. A child is the Jinchuriki of the most powerful entity since the Jubi itself. Naruto nodded, not fully understanding the words the older man was saying. A story for another time, Kit. Right now you have more urgent things to hear. Once again he heard the pang of melancholy in the Kyubi's voice, it just sounded out of place. By now the Kazekage's attention was solely focused on Naruto, he felt the heat of the man's gaze as he searched him for any signs of deceit. Last I heard the Kyubi was under Konoha's control. So why are you here? Naruto became nervous again, unsure of what telling the truth might bring him. On the one hand he still didn't want to do anything to jeopardize his new life, on the other he worried that if people here found out about his past then it would all just repeat itself. I had to leave. He left it at that, it was vague but completely honest, the best of both scenarios. The Kazekage hardly seemed satisfied but he still had many questions, the most important immediately coming to mind. What is the relationship you share with the demon sealed inside of you? You know of it and it hardly seems likely Konoha told you considering what happened to their village 7 years ago. Naruto immediately sent a questioning thought to the Kyubi who stayed mysteriously silent, despite the demon remark. I assume you have had contact with the demon yet you seem healthy enough. Does this mean you are in control of it? Again Naruto was unsure of how to answer, the questions seemed to come non-stop and it took him a moment to catch up. I wouldn't say that. We have more of a... He briefly searched for the right word. An understanding. It appeared that this wasn't the answer the Kazekage had hoped for, however it still seemed that it was good enough and he nodded with his face set back in its previous indifferent state. My son Gaara is like you, the Jinchuriki of the One-Tails, Shukaku. Unlike you his demon torments him, stops him from sleeping and if this carries on I fear I will have to kill my son before he gets out of hand. Naruto would have cried out in protest if Kyubi hadn't quickly shushed him from inside his head. He didn't know if the sound is laced by something but it had an immediate calming effect. I wish for you to help Gaara control the demon within him. Befriend him, train him, beat him if you must. Under his breath he muttered, Orkan, then carried on in his normal tone, but I wish for him to at least gain the same control that you do. He sighed heavily, if that is not the case by this time next year I will unfortunately have to go through with my original plan. Again Naruto wanted to cry out and again Kyubi calmed him quickly. You will live with us in the Kazekage mansion. There are plenty of spare rooms so that he shot a glance at Tayuya who had miraculously stayed perfectly quiet throughout the entire encounter, companion can stay as well. He gave one last nod and the ninja who had escorted them before materialized between the two startled children. The Kazekage waved absently with his hand and the Sand Shinobi gave a curt nod before leading the two out of the office. Once outside Naruto released the breath he hadn't even realized he had been holding. Tayuya seemed equally relieved when he glanced over at her. Next he turned his attention to the small redhead that was now nervously looking over the trio, still desperately clutching his bear. Gaara looked so dejected. Naruto had noticed it as soon as the Kazekage had spoken to him, the shame and loneliness that emanated from him in the older man's presence. Naruto's eyes hardened at the thought and before their escort could do anything he walked over to Gaara in 2 strides. Hi Gaara. The redhead had been staring at the floor before now but was looking with wide eyes into Naruto's face. He had still been puzzling out their earlier confrontation, on some level believing that it was all some hallucination or another cruelty brought on him by the creature living inside of him. Naruto smiled, sensing the nervousness of the smaller boy, and tried to do everything in his power to ease his troubled mind. I think we're going to be friends now. Gaara just kept staring at him with wide, black-rimmed eyes which Naruto had only properly noticed for the first time. He wondered if they were like his whisker marks but filed away the thought for later. Friends. Naruto nodded cheerfully, and after a moment of hesitation Gaara smiled. It was meek and timid, but it was an improvement over before. Their escort had been patient up until now, but he had been given orders by his Kazekage and he would fulfill them. Gaara, your father will see you know. As for you two. He motioned with his hand for Naruto to draw closer and didn't finish his sentence as he firmly placed the same hand on Naruto's shoulder. He still wasn't used to how the world just suddenly blurred, but having already experienced it once he could at least prepare himself. In a few seconds he was in a new, completely unfamiliar environment, much to both his and Tayuya's annoyance. Kankuro. Temari. Naruto cringed at the unexpected outburst from their otherwise stoic and reserved escort, but didn't have time for it as suddenly he heard the rush of feet in the direction. A boy rounded the door first. He was obviously older than Naruto by maybe a year or two. He had hair similar to Gaara's in style but was a dark brown in color. He wore a deep black shirt that seemed many sizes too big for him as it went down to nearly his knees. It was hooded but the cloth was pulled back to rest against his neck right now. Next to enter the room, at a slightly more sedate pace, was a girl, older than the boy. She had sandy blonde hair that was tied up in a long ponytail that swayed behind as she walked. Like the boy, she wore clothing that seemed impractically large for her, a white shirt that seemed more like a dress, especially considering she wore nothing below it, tied up with a red sash. Yes, Baki-sensei. It was the older girl who spoke, even as she curiously glanced over the two children next to him. The boy beside her was less tactful, openly staring at the two with his eyes narrowed, trying to figure out what was going on. I am only here to inform you that these two will be staying here for a while. Temari, the Kazekage has instructed you to show them around before letting them to retire to the rooms nearest Gaara's. The girl that Naruto knew was called Temari nodded hesitantly while the boy narrowed his eyes further. Why? Baki sent a glare the boy's way, but it was completely lost on his otherwise occupied form. Because Kankuro, your father has ordered it. The tone was absolute, enough to get Kankuro to turn sullenly and nod apologetically. Yes, I'm sorry Baki-sensei. Baki nodded approvingly before sparing one last glance around at the four children. A tired sigh managed to escape his lips as he quickly shunshined away, already expecting what was about to happen. All four children watched the swirl of dust and sand until it dissipated before blue and green eyes met black and dark blue. The tension in the room was palpable to the point where Naruto swore the single bead of sweat rolling down his cheek could actually be heard as it arduously made its way across his skin. So, Temari's attempt to break the silence only increased its awkwardness. Luckily, this was one time in Naruto's life that he could honestly say his brash and upfront nature was a help as opposed to a hindrance. Hi, I'm Naruto Uzumaki and this. He motioned across at Tayuya, who still had yet to say a word since entering the Kazekage's office. Is Tayuya. The tension finally broken. Temari smirked evilly but didn't say a word. Kankuro had settled back into glaring at the two younger children. So Naruto, mind explaining why we're going to be living together for the foreseeable future? It was said flippantly, but there was no hiding the underlying curiosity and ever so slight hostility behind the words. Temari proceeded to show the two around the surprisingly large and roomy mansion that the Kazekage called home as he explained what had happened. He noticed the look of unease that passed over the siblings' faces when he mentioned he was a Jinchuriki but made nothing of it. Once the tour was over, Temari brought the pair to a long corridor of bedrooms before showing Naruto into the one he later found out was next to Gaara's. Tayuya was just across the hall from his. Naruto had found that he liked Temari. She was naturally upbeat, much like himself, even if she could be slightly scary at times. He also found out the reason for Kankuro's distrust in that he was extremely protective of his little brother and harbored a natural resentment to people of his age group. Once he heard the story of how Naruto had met Gaara, that distrust started to slip, but he was still a bit distant out of habit. Even so, Kankuro awed him slightly when he broke off from the group only to return slightly later with a large wooden puppet. He had tinkered with it the entire time they walked, and Temari had grown increasingly frustrated with his one-word replies to her questions. Naruto quickly figured that this was a recurring argument and he envied them for having that sibling relationship. The tour ended there and Temari left the young boy to his own devices as she escorted a still nervous-looking Tayuya out and across the hall to her own room. Kankuro stayed behind, watching the two girls leave as well before turning to Naruto and giving him an appraising look. If you're living here, I expect father will have you trained as a shinobi. Naruto was a little shocked. Apart from his outburst in front of Baki, this was the first thing he had actually said to Naruto. If I know my father, he won't waste any time. Get a good night's sleep and be up early tomorrow. He started walking out of the room but called back over his shoulder, because it's the last chance you'll get for a few years. Naruto could practically feel the smirk that radiated off of the boy as he left and he fought back one of his own. Turning, Naruto made his own appraisal of the room. It was incredible. This one room alone was the size of his apartment back in Konoha, and that wasn't even counting the ensuite bathroom that he could see from here. The majority of one corner was taken up by a large bed with beige sheets and darker pillows. There was also a large window which gave him a breathtaking view of Sunagakure that immediately reminded him of the view from atop the Hokage monument, even if the landscape itself was drastically different. After just looking out at the place he was going to be calling home from now on, Naruto released a contented sigh along with a warm smile. Quickly it developed into a mischievous grin as he ran and launched himself onto the bed, reveling in the feeling as the non-rusty springs launched him back into the air. He landed in a laughing heap, snuggling closer into the soft mattress and grabbing a pillow to hold like Gaara did his bear. Before he hadn't felt all that tired, but a yawn broke past his lips. He shrugged. Obviously the tour had taken longer than he thought, although he wasn't surprised considering the sheer size of the building. So what do you think, Kyubi? He heard a chuckle from his mind. I think that I was right. She chuckled again as she felt his quizzical look shot introspectively at her. I was right to tell you to leave the village, don't you think? Naruto nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess you were, but I was actually talking about Gaara. Do you think we can help him? Kyubi growled lightly. The Jinchuriki of Shukaku, so disdainful, sensing the hostility form Naruto, she sighed. He was far too helpful for his own good. My answer though is yes, we should be able to help him. I'll slap some sense into that tanuki. Just don't expect immediate results as this might take time. She sighed again, but it seemed to be for more personal reasons. Honestly, I think I should have done something about his damnable bloodlust before now. Father would be so ashamed. Before Naruto had time to question her, he heard his door open and a familiar scent enter his room. He smiled as he sat up, looking at Tayuya, who just stared at him awkwardly before walking up and climbing under the covers with him. He looked at her questioningly and she just stared back, willing him to say anything before her shoulders drooped slightly. It's fucking cold in this house. She would be damned to admit that it was because she had grown used to his presence curled up next to her as she slept. Just as she would be damned to say that this whole experience left her feeling vulnerable and meek, and that he was the only familiar thing she had to hold on to right now. Naruto said nothing, just as content to let his arm fall into its usual position around Tayuya's waist. By now she thought nothing of it. What have you gotten us into? She yawned but didn't let that stop her finishing her sentence. Shithead, she sighed as she said it, her eyelids drooping wearily before they closed and she was out like a light. Naruto smiled, equally tired, and allowed the soft bed and her equally soft body lull him to sleep, for once foregoing his usual lesson. His dreams were filled with thoughts of the future, what life in Suna would bring to him, now that he had friends. Gaara walked into the large bedroom, amused by what he saw. Naruto sat on his bed with his legs crossed and was ferociously trying to file down his fingernails. Although to call them that wouldn't do them justice, in actuality they were more like claws, vicious white claws that no matter what Naruto did, refused to be broken or filed down. Naruto had a look of utmost concentration as he swiped what must have been a carpenter's metal file over the tough appendages. Gaara watched on as the file became a blur as Naruto moved it faster and faster, harder and harder against his impossibly tough nails. Finally he stopped, grinning down at his hand as a small cloud of dust floated away from where metal had met claw. The grin immediately turned into a frustrated frown when he saw that his efforts were in vain. All he got for his trouble was a deep gash running along the center of the file. The file was the one being eroded away, not the claw. With an irritated grunt he chucked the file into a small pile of its likewise damaged counterparts that had accumulated behind him. Why do you even bother anymore? Naruto looked up in shock at the gravelly voice that had interrupted his peace. He had been so wrapped up in his task that even his advanced senses had missed Gaara's entry into the room. It did help that the two boys were nigh inseparable, so Naruto nearly always had his scent nearby. He looked up at the boy who had become one of his closest friends in the 7 years they had lived together and grown closer. 7 years had done a lot for the Suna redhead. He was no longer the timid and shy little boy that Naruto had first known him as. Far from it, he had grown into a confident and intelligent teenager. It was only a shame that the physical changes were less pronounced. Gaara was always small for his age, mostly due to his premature birth. His skin was also unnaturally pale for somebody who lived in a desert, although that was for entirely different reasons. He wore simple black shinobi pants with an equally dark black shirt with a fishnet vest underneath that just inched out past the short sleeves. Over the top he had a white sash that crossed over one shoulder, which also acted as the holder for his enormous gourd, which was almost as inseparable to him as Naruto. He smiled as he thought of all the times when they were young and had tried to find a better way of carrying around all of the chakra-infused sand that Gaara used, and failed. It turned out a massive container really was the best way. It was only a plus that the gourd itself was made out of the same sand. They get in the way. Naruto shrugged as he said it, standing up from his bed and walking the short distance to stand across from Gaara. He wasn't the only one that the passage of time had managed to change, and while hardly tall himself he still managed to stand a few inches above Gaara. His previously stunted growth was more nurture than nature, a result of his poor, or sometimes non-existent, diet. Now that he was eating properly he was more average for his age group. His spiky blonde hair was untamed as it tried, unsuccessfully, to fall past his forehead protector and cover his eyes. It did however manage to frame his face with two shaggy bangs that Tayuya had been trying to convince him to cut for a while now, saying it made him seem uncaring. Of course that was exactly how Naruto felt about it. He never did pay much mind to how appeared, except of course when it came to hygiene. This was also the main reason for his very casual attire consisting of black shinobi pants that stayed unbound around his feet just above his normal black shinobi sandals. Above that he wore a muted orange t-shirt with a large black swirl design, and over the top was his comfortable dark green jacket that stayed unzipped except on mission. Despite his size and age, Naruto managed to cast an imposing, yet carefree aura with his wild appearance and casual clothing, not to mention the slitted eyes, fang-like canines and the aforementioned claws. Would you like me to create a file for you? Naruto just shrugged. He had no real problem with the anatomical additions to his form that Kyuubi seemed to enjoy so much. It was just they got in the way of a few simple things that frustrated him daily. He looked behind him at suspect number 1 that stared blankly back at him. Nah, I'll just stick to the normal way. He placed his hands into a seal and quickly channeled chakra until there was a small burst of white smoke. When it cleared, Naruto stood as he had before, only his more wild traits were noticeably absent. Kyuubi, true to her word, had made sure that the henge was the very first technique that Naruto learned, and it had come in handy ever since. So I guess you're here because Baki-sensei wants to see us about something. Gaara nodded. The two might have been best friends, but the redhead still wasn't the talkative type. The both walked out together and immediately walked into Tayuya, who was emerging from her own room. Naruto thought that sarcastically because every night for 7 years Tayuya had snuck out of that room and slept in his bed. It wasn't that he minded, quite the contrary, it was just that by now the entire household knew and he was a little tired of the charade. It was Tayuya's stubborn pride that stopped her from just straight moving into his room. Like the two boys, the young red-haired girl had undergone a few more noticeable changes in the near decade they had all been together. She stood just under Naruto in height, but with a significantly slimmer build that might be described as lithe if it didn't hold the wrong connotations. Gone was the scrawny orphan that Naruto had first been forced into joining all those years. Her hair was longer, now reaching her lower back in an unruly mess that still managed to hold on to some semblance of shape thanks to Temari's intervention. The red mass was tied back by a jet black bandana that held her forehead protector, only allowing one stray lock of hair to fall between her eyes down to her nose. She wore black shinobi pants like the two boys, but cut to a more feminine fit and shortened to her mid-calf. Also like the two boys, she wore the standard black shinobi sandals, however unlike them she wore a very light white shirt that was cut at her midriff. It exposed her stomach below her navel, or at least it would have except for the wrappings that wound around her torso. However, those did nothing to hide the two newly protruding lumps that were beginning to show on her chest. She had complained a lot when they first appeared, citing them as nuisances to her training as they always seemed to get in the way. However, one day after a talk with Temari that Naruto couldn't quite hear and had left the younger girl quite red, she had simply stopped complaining. Naruto was only happy. It made no difference to him how Tayuya looked, yet despite him saying this a few times, she only shot him evil looks. As he walked out into the hallway, he idly wondered how they felt before his eyes widened and he banished the thought. Where had that come from? The three nodded at one another, no words needing to be said between the three longtime friends as they wound their way through the complex halls of the Kazekage mansion. It was second nature by now, the winding halls each imprinted on their memories irrevocably. Eventually the trio reached the room where Baki would always meet them for mission updates or to begin their training. As it was, he wasn't there yet, unusual as he was normally an extremely prompt individual. He sighed loudly. What kind of inconsiderate sensei was late anyway? A few hundred miles away across national borders, a masked ninja sneezed loudly. Unfortunately for him, he was currently jumping through trees at high pace. The unexpected sneeze caught him completely by surprise and ruined his concentration just long enough for him to smack headfirst into the unyielding bough of a tree. He sat on the leaf-strewn ground rubbing his sore head, wondering where that sneeze came from. Naruto shrugged. Considering it was their sensei's first offense, he decided to let it slide. Instead, he moved over to the window and took up his normal position on the window sill with one leg dangling over the side. He reached back into his pouch and pulled out the small orange book that lay inside. With a small lick to his thumb, he found the page he was on and started to read. Ever since he had found the Land of Fire's #1 best-selling series, it had nearly become inseparable from his person. It wasn't actually the smut he was interested in, there was a genuinely interesting story that his pre-adolescent mind could appreciate thanks to his lack of hormones at the time. He also connected with the main character of the series, also called Naruto, who shared his determined drive and spirit. Of course, now that he was on the cusp of puberty, those other sections began to draw more notice. Gaara, on the other hand, rolled his eyes wearily at the sight. Must you keep reading that? Naruto just absent-mindedly nodded, barely paying heed to the smaller boy's words. Tayuya, on the other hand, took a more direct approach, storming up to his position on the windowsill angrily. What the fuck have I told you about reading that, Naruto? The blonde Jinchuriki cringed back from the steaming girl, only offering a small shrug and a frightened expression as answer. Angrily, the girl snatched the book out of his hands and shot down any attempt at him taking it back with a murderous glare. But Tayuya, her eyes hardened and her hand reached dangerously behind her back into the special red leather pouch she kept there. Naruto's eyes widened and he withdrew his hand. I told you not to read the fucking book, shithead. Again Naruto cringed back from the furious words. I haven't reached this volume and I don't want any spoilers. Naruto just nodded timidly like a kicked puppy. He wasn't the only one of the trio who had taken a shine to the racy series of books. Gaara sighed loudly and rolled his eyes again, willing their sensei to just show up so he wouldn't have to deal with his slightly perverted teammates so early in the morning. Luckily for him, just that happened and Baki entered the room in an overenthusiastic display of the Shunshin skill, neatly covering the entire room in a layer of dust and sand. Baki-sensei, what the fuck do you think? Tayuya was cut off as Baki sprinted across the room, kunai raised and poised to slice into her throat. She barely had enough time to pull out a senbon and counter. The ring of clashing metal immediately drew Naruto out of the book he was reading to stare in bemusement at the scene. Baki was always doing this, attacking the trio whenever he had the opportunity to test their reflexes. Good. I would hate to think your foul mouth would get in the way of your reaction times. Tayuya just went the faintest hue of red as Baki straightened up from his combat stance and wiped the remaining dust from his flak jacket. Even their sensei had changed in the past couple years. When Naruto had first met him, he was covered nearly head to toe in bandaged from a lightning burn he received when fighting a powerful Kumo nin. Baki had won, but at the cost of a great deal of his skin. Nowadays he wore a veil covering the left side of his face where the burn was strongest. Well, anyway, you're all here so we can begin. Gaara stood from the chair he had been sitting in and Naruto happily jumped down from the window sill. This was how Baki always started their conversations when it concerned a mission, although Tayuya still looked like a dog licking its wounds. The Kazekage himself has given us an important mission. He gave them some time to let that sink in. Your first S rank. Both Tayuya and Naruto's jaws hit the ground while Gaara maintained his perfect emotionless expression that he had perfected over the years. The only indication he had even heard the shocking revelation was the slight raising of a single eyebrow. Awesome, it's about damn time. Naruto was ecstatic, practically hopping around the room. The only thing stopping him from actually doing so was the memory of what Tayuya had done the last time he had. Tayuya was just as excited, although she had a better hold on her emotions and kept it in long enough to let Baki finish. Yes, well, like I was saying, he stressed the last word enough to get Naruto to calm down. The Kazekage himself has given us this mission, so I no doubt won't have to remind of just how important that makes it. The three genin nodded, one a bit too vigorously for Baki's liking. Very well, then here are your mission dossiers. He handed each one out and Naruto immediately ripped the brown packaging off, his eyes hungrily flicking back and forth across the words concealed inside. Of course, as he read, his excited grin turned emotionless, followed by a frown, very quickly followed by a look of fury. What the hell, Baki-sensei? Is this some kind of joke? His answer was a very stern look that clearly said that it was no such thing. Naruto knew it was not. Baki was not the type of ninja to joke around with anything, but he still had to be sure. What does the Kazekage think he's doing? Going to war with the Leaf Village? Is he insane? Baki wearily noticed that Tayuya was nodding along with Naruto's sentiment. Naruto, we are shinobi of the sand. The Kazekage's word is law and you would do well to remember that. He tried to put some righteousness into his speech, but as he finished he saw that Naruto was already gone, the window open and the curtains billowing in the wake the boy left. He sighed loudly into his hand. His day just kept getting worse. First he's given this very suspicious mission, then Naruto just has to act like, well, Naruto. He couldn't help but share the boy's feelings, however. It was incredibly strange, and allying themselves with the Sound Village only added to that. He raised his face from his palm only to see that Tayuya was now gone as well, leaving him alone with Gaara, who was curiously poking at the book Naruto had left behind in his rush. Baki slammed his head back into his hands. It was going to be a long day, that much he could tell. Naruto sped through the village, the short distance from the Kazekage mansion to the council building taking him no time at all. He moved like lightning through all his usual shortcuts, through back alleys and over rooftops. He even dived through the living room of a very surprised elderly couple who always left their windows open. He didn't have time to make his usual rushed apology as he springboarded off the wall outside the window and spun up onto the adjacent roof. With a final leap he was into the office building, racing through the cramped, earthen hallways that he knew almost as well as his home for the past 7 years. It was another short distance up a few floors and through the maze of the many council halls and chambers until, with a deep breath to somewhat calm himself, he walked through the Kazekage's chamber door. The receptionist didn't even try to stop him anymore, it had become so routine. Immediately he knew there was something wrong. The Kazekage was not in this room, yet somebody was sitting in the chair behind his desk and for some reason had his robes and hat on. The intruder looked up, surprised yet keeping an air of calm that seemed overtly practiced. He obviously knew how to play his role well. The only way Naruto even knew this wasn't the Kazekage was because he smelt all wrong. Even Naruto knew that smells and scents could be overridden or submerged, but nothing could hide from Naruto, not at this distance. There was nothing of the Kazekage about this imposter. Instead he smelt of blood, deep tunnels, dampness and snakes. Naruto eyed the man wearily, wondering what kind of move he was going to make now that he was here. Instead he just looked very calmly towards what he perceived as an intruder. Yes, Naruto, what is it now? So the man knew his name. That was even more worrying. It meant he had done his research. He smirked, obviously not enough to know how heightened his senses were. Not that many people knew that tidbit. Who are you? There was steel in Naruto's voice, which the imposter only seemed amused at. Whatever are you talking about, Naruto? Naruto could hear the amusement in his voice, but he didn't even realize he was only affirming Naruto's suspicions. He was a good actor, but he spoke nothing like the Kazekage, even if he somehow had his voice. The man reached up and Naruto immediately tensed, but all he did was remove his hat. Naruto was shocked. Behind the hat was the Kazekage, or at least his face anyway. Kai. Naruto immediately tried to dispel any genjutsu in the room, but nothing happened. The imposter maintained his amused expression, but anybody could clearly see his patience was beginning to wear. At that moment an Anbu operative dropped down from the ceiling, placing a hand on Naruto's shoulder. Naruto, what are you doing? Naruto turned to the specialist, with a cold gaze. This man is not the Kazekage, he smells of blood and snakes. The operative immediately turned to the man in question. Every member of the Anbu was privy to the knowledge about Naruto's remarkable nose, even the Kazekage himself had praised its use on countless missions. They also knew that it was never wrong, ever. Who are you? Even as he said it, 4 more Anbu dropped from the darkness of the ceiling and took up combat positions, all in the direction of the imposter Kazekage. The man sneered in annoyance, standing up, everybody in the room tensing. You would trust this mere genin over your own Kazekage. The first ANBU's eyes narrowed. It didn't take someone with perceptive hearing to know that was not how the Kazekage acted. Sir, I need authorization. Your code now or we will be forced to engage. It was a fleeting hope. Everybody could already tell that this man had no such intention of complying. And to prove them right, he smiled an evil grin that looked eerily snake-like before leaping back out of the window with inhuman speed, immediately followed by the Anbu who now fully understood the situation. The Kazekage was dead. This man had taken his place and had tried to get him to initiate war on the Leaf. Anger shot through Naruto's being and he felt a familiar burning sensation spread out from his core. It was only halted as he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Baki had finally caught up with him. The alien chakra retreated, leaving Naruto slightly hollow and empty inside. He felt limp, wanting to throw up. The evil smell of the imposter lingered in the room, filing his nose with death and decay. You don't need to follow them, Naruto. The Anbu will do the job protecting Lord Kazekage, even after death. Even if they cannot, then what makes you believe you can take on a man who could defeat the late Kazekage? Naruto slumped slightly, knowing it was true, but he hated being this helpless. He may not have liked the Kazekage a great deal from the way he treated his children, and not just Gaara, but he still didn't deserve murder. He nodded wearily before being led out of the office, the smell somehow lingering in his nose still. They walked through the sand village, student and pupil not saying a word to one another. News spread like wildfire in this village, and only 10 minutes after they had left the office, news had already spread that the Kazekage had been murdered and his killer had escaped. A sinking feeling came over Naruto, knowing that they were walking back to his home, where 3 people would have yet to hear the news. They hurried through the forest in silence, awkward oppressive silence that threatened to drive Naruto insane if it carried on any longer. He raised a hand to tell his 2 companions to stop and they pulled over into a nearby clearing. Immediately Tayuya rushed over to see what the matter was while Gaara approached in a much more sedate manner. Naruto watched his surrogate brother with sadness. Even through his emotionless shell he could sense the sorrow emanating out from the sand wielder. We can stop and rest here for a bit, we're already well ahead of Temari's team. Tayuya seemed ready to argue, but when Naruto motioned with his head over to Gaara she stopped, biting back her words. She nodded wearily and went to fill up their canteens from the nearby stream while Naruto approached Gaara. He stood in the clearing, not quite sure what to do with himself, and Naruto felt a twinge in his heart. There was a lack of purpose there, one that Naruto knew all too well from when he was younger. A lack of purpose that he had shared until he met Tayuya and later Gaara. They had filled that hole with a need to defend those precious to him. It was something that had never occurred to him before, having nobody in his life that was worth protecting, nobody that cared about him enough for him to care about them. That had all changed with him leaving the village, and now it was his turn to return the favor. Hey Gaara, wanna spar for a bit while we wait for your brother and sister to catch up? The boy shrugged and immediately Naruto felt another twinge. Gaara almost never passed up an opportunity to spar with him. He cursed the council for the decision to go ahead with sending them to the Chunin exams. He understood it, of course. It would seem highly suspicious for Suna to suddenly pull out, not a week from the exams, even with the murder of their Kazekage. It still didn't mean he liked it. Gaara needed familiarity right now, to stay at home and have time to grieve. What he certainly didn't need was to be thrown into some kind of contest of violence and espionage for some meaningless title. The 3 of them together had already completed over 5 A-ranked missions. If that didn't make them Chunin, then what did? Most of all he cursed the man he had found out to be called Orochimaru. He didn't have a lot of time to research him. All he got was that he was one of the Sannin and a rogue ninja from the Leaf. It was all his fault, that Gaara's father had died, that they were going to these exams, that Suna now lacked its leader. The only consolation they had was the pay they were receiving from their slightly altered S-ranked mission. The council believed that Orochimaru might still go ahead with his previous invasion plan, with or without Suna. The job was now to provide whatever aid they could to Konoha if that were to happen. He grimaced coldly. The sand just wanted to cover their own asses and reaffirm their allegiance with the leaf. Seeing Gaara's reluctance, Naruto gave up. He wanted to help his friends still, but he would find another way. A mischievous twinkle ignited in his eye that even the sadness that had surrounded him recently couldn't extinguish. He crept over to Gaara, one eye on Tayuya the entire time, and whispered devilishly into his ear. The sand user managed to stay impassive, but Naruto could easily see the old Gaara begin to leak back out as he explained his plan. A few moments later he was next to Tayuya, watching as she filled up the last of their canteens and placed it neatly to the side of the stream. She stood and turned around in one motion, nearly jumping out of her skin as she saw just how close Naruto was to her. Their faces were only inched apart and she could feel the breath from his nose on her cheek. Naruto faltered for a moment. The plan was in his mind, but the sheer proximity between the two suddenly made him nervous for a reason he couldn't quite understand. Tayuya's cheeks gained the slightest tinge of red, another thing that confused Naruto. She only did that when very angry or really embarrassed. Naruto thought in a split second as the two just stood there, she couldn't have been embarrassed, right? They had definitely been this close before. With a start he realized, or at least thought, that meant she was angry, so before she could punch him he grinned wildly and gave her the lightest of nudges. Not expecting the sudden push, Tayuya's eyes widened as she was put off balance and tumbled back. Her arms windmilled crazily as she tried to right herself, but the softened earth under her feet wasn't having it. She fell backwards with her eyes closed tight, awaiting the splash and the freezing water below her, only for an arm to reach out and securely grip her own. She opened an eye to see Naruto still grinning, firmly gripped her arm and reaching out with his other. She narrowed her eyes at him, promising with a single look that he was going to pay for this. She reached out with her other arm for Naruto's free hand, but as soon as her fingers brushed his, he suddenly and unexpectedly released his grip on her other arm. Once again she fell backwards, flailing her arms madly as she tumbled over the edge of the river bank. She again closed her eyes again and expectantly embraced for the freezing water, only to be saved again, this time by a blanket of silky soft sand. She cracked an eye open and looked at Gaara, nodding to him with a thankful expression before getting up, standing on the floating cloud of sand. She stared daggers at Naruto, a glare that could have made most men instinctively reach for their most precious anatomical area. Naruto, on the other hand, maintained his cocky grin as Tayuya began walking across the sand towards him, hands clenched into fists. Naruto, I'm gonna shove a fucking kunai so far up your shitter that you'll cough up senbons. Unfortunately, Tayuya only realized her mistake when Naruto shot an amused glance at Gaara. Immediately the sand under Tayuya's feet dissipated before she could jump to safety. Without anything to catch her this time, Tayuya dropped straight into the icy waters beneath her, letting out an all-too-girly shriek as the chill invaded her clothes. Naruto shared a good laugh with Gaara as he cheerfully walked across to the soaked girl, casually walking across the surface of the water and extending a hand. She glared up at him from her position half in the water before an evil smirk of her own graced her features. Naruto saw this and tried to react, but before he could, Tayuya had taken the offered hand and sent a pulse of chakra through Naruto's system, immediately disrupting his concentration. For a split second Naruto sent too much chakra to his feet. Unfortunately for him, a split second was all it took and he was sent rocketing into the air as he repelled the water. Tayuya snorted out in laughter as the flailing boy came crashing back down to earth and splashed into the freezing water. She walked over this time and offered the hand. She only took advantage of Naruto's trusting nature once, dropping him back into the water when she picked him up a little. This was how Temari, Kankuro and their teammate Masa found them, sitting around a fire as the two soaked shinobi dried off. They noticed immediately that the faintest of smiles was alighting itself on Gaara's lips as he shared a laugh with his oldest friends. This sight alone was enough to get the two older Suna shinobi smiling. They had taken their father's death hard and it warmed them to see that Gaara was still able to smile. A few minutes later and the six ninja were racing through the trees. Tayuya and Naruto were dried off enough and they decided not to wait any longer. There was no warning, the trees didn't get any less thick. In face, the only indication they were heading in the right direction at all was Naruto's nose, but sure enough the tree line dropped out from under them and they found themselves in front of a pair of impressive gates. They were currently open to allow the throng of people into and out of the village. The familiar sight sent a wave of melancholy through Naruto as he remembered these were the very gates that he had escaped from the village through. The group approached the gate guards in their small kiosk-like hut and signed all the appropriate papers about them entering for the Chunin exams. One of the guards, a man with spiky purple hair and a small clean-shaven beard with a linen bandage across his nose, looked at Naruto curiously. The boy tried to ignore it as he walked away, but he still felt the gate guard's eyes bore a hole in his back. What the fuck was that guy's problem? He was looking at you like the Shinigami incarnate. Tayuya had sidled over to where Naruto was walking and he just shrugged in response. She eyed him curiously. Naruto was still a notoriously bad liar, at least to her and Gaara, and he was as transparent as a wall was to a Byakugan user. Naruto, what have I told you about lying to me? There was a cold edge to her voice, but there was no hiding the underlying concern. I'm worried that people might recognize me, Tayuya. It's only been 7 years. She nodded understandingly. Yeah, you might be right, but don't worry. It's not like somebody's just going to see you and shout out your name like a fucking Naruto. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.